Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 9th of September of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start not with the South Donetsk direction or with the Pokrovsk. Today we're going to begin the video with the Kherson direction, where the Russians continue clashes for islands. You know that during the previous few weeks, when the Ukrainians began their full-scale offensive operation in the Kursk direction, when the Russians began their full-scale offensive in direction of Pokrovsk, also the Russians launched another operation, and this is a Dnipro Island operation. And if we increase the numbers of days just from the beginning of September, we're going to see significant number of geolocations of how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians along the islands. And telling the truth and summarizing everything, summarizing every single report we've received during the previous, since the beginning of September, we can make a conclusion that most likely currently the Russians control around 80, 70 or 90% of the islands between Ukrainian bank of the river and the Russian one. So obviously this is significant progress, and the most important is what is the purpose of Russian activity between the islands, because it's very difficult to hold these positions, but for some reason the Russians decided to do this. And first of all, of course, the Russians are not planning to cross the river. The Russians are not planning to land in the Kherson direction, at least at this stage of the special military operation. Maybe they're going to do this in the future, but the main purpose of the current stage of the Kherson offensive is to bring as much as possible forces to the line of combat contact to the Ukrainian bank of the river, which will allow the Russians to release significant number of forces from the Kherson direction and to redeploy them somewhere in direction of Kursk or in the Pokrovsk area. Because if the Ukrainians someday decide to counterattack and to restore or to land on the Russian side of Kherson, anyway, the Ukrainians will be forced to spend significant number of days to get back the islands. And of course, this is going to be enough of time for the Russians to redeploy forces back. So I suppose and we expect that soon the Russians are going to redeploy forces from the Kherson direction to probably the Pokrovsk, with the purpose to reinforce offensive and to break the Ukrainians' defense belt completely. As for this video, as you can see, the Ukrainians continue using flamethrower drones, and you know that the Ukrainians began using this type of weapon probably 2 weeks ago or something like this, and by the 9th of September we managed to get additional feedback from the Russian soldiers about this type of weapon. And you know, the Russians are saying that this drone and this let's say munition is not dangerous for the Russian soldiers. Of course, it's dangerous when you're sleeping and when drone began attacking you with the thermobaric let's say shells right now in this moment, and when you were sleeping you can die, of course, as a result of this attack. But the Russians are saying if you're in your position and if you control the situation, this drone can't do anything to you, especially to soldier, to manpower. But the Russians confirmed that this drone deals significant damage to Russian positions. As a use of this drone, the Russians can use the entire line of trenches, fortifications, ammo, weapon, everything can be burned as a result of this attack, because the Russians are saying that the temperature of this let's say thermobaric shell is more than from 2 till 2.5 thousand Celsius. So it's a very hot weapon. Now let's move further, and first let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue offensive operation. We have some changes on the ground, as you can see, and we have lots of updates, and there are very heavy clashes right now. First, let's talk about the village of Pavlivka, and today we got the video how the Russian Sons of Anarchy were attacking the Ukrainian positions, how the Russians using bikes crossed Kashlygach river, how the Russian bikers managed to enter the farms and to capture some positions in the area. Currently, it's very difficult to understand what exactly the Russians were planning to achieve by this attack. The Russians managed to capture the farms, but as you can see, we haven't colored the map because later the Ukrainians launched counterattack with drones and there was a mass, so it's very difficult to understand whether the Russians managed to save their control over this territory or not. But anyway, we can make a conclusion that the Russians tried to cross, and the most important, and obviously the Russians were trying to pin the Ukrainian reserves and reinforcements down and not to allow the Ukrainians from Vuhledar to redeploy their forces, let's say in direction of the coal mine or in direction of the village of Vodyane. And most likely the Russians managed to achieve this goal. Now let's talk about the coal mine by the name of South Donbass number 1. Today the Russian sources published the video of how they were bombing and attacking some facilities on the territory of the coal mine. And first of all, this is very important video because we were guessing whether the Russians managed to establish complete control over the territory or not, and now we start receiving the answers to the question that most likely there are still Ukrainian positions on the territory of the coal mine. The Russians also have some positions in the same territory, so there's like some mass in this area, and the Russians completely control the initiative, and the Russians are trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back. So in this video, the Russians were bombing this small building right on the base of the Kherson. Now let's move further. Now let's talk about Vodyane, because the heaviest clashes are taking place exactly in this area. So today we got first geolocations, first pictures, not videos, pictures that confirm complete Russian control over some territory around Vodyane and the coal mines and so on. So today the pro-Ukrainian sources, the pro-Ukrainian mappers published the map, and they published just this photo with several pictures on it, and according to them, on these pictures we can see the presence of the Russian soldiers between the buildings and how the Ukrainians were after withdrawing the Russians there. So some of the buildings were geolocated exactly along this street in this place, and based on this video and based on this photo more precisely, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor, but we have added just this small part. We still haven't received anything from the industrial zone, from the Vuhledar plant. We still haven't received anything from this area. On the other hand, we received today the video of how the Russians were after withdrawing the Ukrainian positions here. So this video, for example, confirms that maybe there are still Ukrainian positions in this part of Vodyane. Anyway, there are very heavy clashes, and the map has been changed. Of course, this is very important. And today we got an additional batch of videos from the coal mine of South Donbass number 3. So there are lots of videos, and today the sources reported, including pro-Russian sources, that the Russians, the first Russian groups, the edge Russian forces, managed to enter the territory, and that there are very heavy clashes right now exactly on the territory of the industrial zone. So what's about the geolocations? We have some. The Russians are bombing this territory heavily. They were bombing. Most likely they will continue the process because there are a lot of buildings, very big buildings, that Ukrainians turned into strongholds. There are lots of such positions, fire positions, anti-tank positions. So this is a very powerful stronghold, of course, and the Russians will be forced to pay a significant price to take under control this territory. But if the Russians are able to do this, of course we can start counting days, not just for the village and the stronghold of Vuhledar, but obviously for the entire south and Donetsk direction. Lots of explosions, lots of FPV drone attacks, and the Russians are very, very serious about this direction. Furthermore, we have another report. We start receiving additional reports from the village of Kostiantynivka, and this post was published by the pro-Ukrainian sources, by the official Telegram channel of the 79th Air Mobile Brigade, and the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to enter the village of Kostiantynivka. Furthermore, the Russians reported that the Ukrainians reported that currently the Russians are trying to dig in deeper and to, let's say, prepare or to create a stable and strong positions in this part. Of course, we understand if the Russians are able to do this, then we can start counting days when the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back from Kostiantynivka. And the most important is not just the positions inside of the village. The most important is the speed, the time that the Russians spent to take under control Kostiantynivka. I'll just would like to remind you that during the battle for Novohrodivka, the Russians spent around 8 till 12 months to take under control the village. During the battle for Konstantinovka, the Russians, let's say, spent from 4 till 6 months. And as for Kostiantynivka, the village was captured by the Russians 3 weeks or 4 weeks after the Russians established complete control over Konstantinovka. So this is very fast. This is very fast, and the Russians are getting faster and faster and faster. So with the same situation as we used to see in the Pokrovsk direction, we might see in this area as well. The Russians at some point can start just moving further in the northwestern direction, and then we're gonna see every single day another video with the Russian flag above the villages. Of course, the Ukrainians can't allow themselves to get in this situation, because if they lose few more villages on the Kurakhove direction, then this is going to be complete collapse of the South Donetsk area. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Krasnohorivka. Right before we start making in the video, we got report from pro-Russian sources from official channel of the DPR, Donetsk People Republic. They reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the city by the name of Krasnohorivka, which confirms that the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to reach the most western buildings of Lazova Street. So this is very important, because by this advance the Russians got closer and closer, are getting closer and closer to Kurakhove itself and to the last evacuation roads from the fields to the west of Nivoyska to the mainland. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the village of Ukrainsk and the village of Girnik. So what we don't have a lot of updates. We have just some fire anomalies. For example, in this video we can see the current situation in the village of Lisovka and the current situation in the city of Ukrainsk. So as you can see, the entire territory is set on fire. The most important that currently the biggest fire anomalies we can find exactly in the southern part of Ukrainsk, which confirms that the Russians entered the city from the south and that there are very heavy clashes right now. Furthermore, we have additional video of how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainian positions right exactly in the southern part of Ukrainsk, which confirms the Russians are moving from the southern part and they're just trying to clear the territory for the Russian forces. Now let's move further and let's talk about the village of Girnik, the city of Girnik. According to information we have, the Russians entered the northern part. Currently there are very heavy clashes. During the previous few days we got the same reports, but those were just Reco in combat or Reco in force, and now the Russians are saying that they entered the city with the regular army. So let's wait for additional updates, and maybe tomorrow the pro-Ukrainian sources and mappers will adjust their maps in Russian favor. Furthermore, we got a very interesting report from the village of Memryk. Today the Russian sources reported that the group of forces center of the Russian army managed to establish complete control over the village of Memryk. According to the geolocation and according to the videos with flag, the Russians managed to do this a long time ago. So we have the video of Russian presence here, was published on the 28th of August. So a long time ago the Russians have already raised the flag on the territory of the village, but that just now, it's like 11-12 days later, the Russians confirmed this information. This is very important because the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation and the current status on the ground and current reports on the ground that we receive from geolocations and from different mappers have distance around 12 days, so around 2 weeks. So the Minister of Defense is always trying to get us different mappers and different sources on the ground. So, but as for today, as for the current situation, according to the Minister of Defense, the Russians in their official statements got the real line of combat contact. So as you can see, the gap is around 14 days, and now we see that during the previous 14 days the Russians haven't managed to improve their positions almost at all. So they captured the village of Lisovka. According to different sources, they entered the village of Ukrainsk, but the Minister of Defense get the same line as we can see right now on the ground. So it's very important to understand, and this is another confirmation that yes, most likely the Ukrainian sources and Syrsky was correct when saying that the line of combat contact was stabilized. Now let's move to the city of we have additional geolocations. There are very heavy clashes in the same area, in the area of the bridge, in the intersection of the railway bridge and just a regular road. The Ukrainians were using this territory to send forces in the central and the western part of Mykolaivka. The Russians, as we can see, got tired from this situation. They decided to destroy the bridge completely and they decided to block the territory. So this video confirms few things. First of all, the Russians are in defense state, and the second thing, the Ukrainians are launching one attempt to counterattack after another. We have very interesting video from a little bit northern area, and this video that we will not watch the video till the end. We can see 3 Russian soldiers who were going in direction of the building, but they were ambushed by the Ukrainians. So as I understand, the Ukrainians managed to cross the railways, and now the Ukrainians entered the village of Mykolaivka, and now the second battle for Mykolaivka has begun. The first one was when the Russians entered and captured the village and then moved further in the western direction, and now the Ukrainians crossed the river across the railways and began the battle for taking the village back under their control. So this is very interesting because Ukrainians began regaining lost positions during the Russian offensive operation during the first days, during the late August and the beginning of September. Novohrodivka, we have a lot of very interesting updates, and as you can see, we have adjusted the map, and according to information we have, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the city was completely captured by the Russians during the previous 48 hours. The Russians managed to secure the area, and we have a lot of videos, a lot of episodes of how the Russians were raising the flag in different parts of this small city. That is very important for the Russians, and now the Russians officially confirmed that they managed to secure the area, and most likely the Russians are planning to move further in the western direction. We made this conclusion based on this on the several geolocations of FPV drone attacks that have been taking place since the 8th and 7th of September. And this is very important because if you remember, when we were talking about this offensive, about the Pokrovsk offensive, first we were talking about the death roads. We were talking about the situation when the Russian FPV drones were controlling this or that road, and they were destroying significant number of armored vehicles, personal carriers, evacuation machines. And this control over this or that part of the road always led to the situation when the Ukrainians lost the ground between the death road and the edge Russian positions. And for the previous few days, we haven't been receiving anything about any death road, and we were wondering where exactly when and where exactly we are going to receive additional progress of FPV drone operators, and we received the progress, and the progress is taking place towards the village of Dachinske. So this territory is under complete Russian FPV drone control, which means that the Russians are trying to cut the landfill, this Telecom from Ukrainian supply and support, the village of Sukhoy Yar, Lisovka, and Dachinske also from Ukrainian supply and support, which confirms that most likely during the next few days, maybe weeks, the Russians would try to attack in this direction and to take under control these huge territories, including the landfill and the villages that we've just discussed. The thing is that if the Russians are able to do this, first of all, they will be able to cut M30 road between the city of Pokrovsk and the city of Selidova, which will lead to additional collapse of logistic of armored forces of Ukraine. And the second thing, the Russians will be able to split this territory in two, and then Ukrainians will be forced to keep additional reinforcements and reserves in Pokrovsk, expecting and waiting for the Russian offensive operation. And this will lead also to the situation when the Ukrainians would be forced to keep additional forces in the city of Selidova, expecting the Russian offensive in this direction as well. But the Russians, on the other hand, will have to keep just one army somewhere in this area, and they will be able to choose where exactly to attack. Of course, completely much better situation in comparison with the Ukrainian one. So anyway, this is not so fast operation. This is not going to happen like within one day. There are a lot of job to do. The Ukrainians redeployed additional forces and reinforcements, so that's why it will take time. But obviously, this is exactly the direction where the Russians are going to move. Now let's move to the Niu-York Toretsk agglomeration. We have a lots of changes on the ground. The most important, the Russians captured the prison. The Toretsk prison number 13 or number 12, number 2. Yes, we have geolocations that were published by the Ukrainians, by the 100th Brigade. In this video, we can see a lot of episodes of how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians all over the entire Toretsk direction. Lots of attacks, lots of explosions, lots of episodes that were geolocated. And based on the geolocations we've received, we have changed the map in Russian favor. So the Russians moved through the citadel, and now the battle for the central part of Toretsk is about to begin. Now let's move further to the Chasiv Yar direction. As you can see, we haven't received anything special, just regular activity of Russian FPV drone operators. The Russians are, during the previous 24 hours, were concentrated and focused on destroying Ukrainian equipment, radars, communications, and so on. Now let's move further. As for the Sivers direction, we haven't received anything from this area during the previous 24 hours, just small activity. We haven't received anything from the south and Kupiansk direction, just regular activity, as well as from from the north in Kupiansk. Just with one difference, today the Ukrainian sources published the video how they were counterattacking the Russian forces to the west of the village by the name of Pisyane. And in this video we can see the work of Ukrainian BMP, and the Ukrainian BMP was attacking the tree lines with the Russian forces from the north. We will return back to the map version. We will try to make a model how exactly the Ukrainians were attacking. So this is the moment when the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russian positions. This video was geolocated, this tree line was geolocated, the position of Ukrainian tank was geolocated, the positions of Russian forces were geolocated as well. So if we go back to map, the Ukrainian tank was moving something like this from the village of Kolesnikovka. The Ukrainians entered the fields, and then the Ukrainians turned to this in the southern direction. Somewhere in this point, the Ukrainians stopped and began bombing and attacking this tree line. So once again, this is Ukrainian BMP that was moving through the fields, and as you can see, the fields were without mines, so no mine fields, which is very important. And the Ukrainians reached this line, and from this line, the Ukrainians were attacking these Russian positions. So the fields were completely unmined and completely clear, which is big and epic failure of the armed forces of Ukraine. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kursk direction. We have lots of interesting updates, and the most important, we have a lot of geolocations of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions. The thing is, and the problem is, that Ukrainians during the active phase of the Kursk offensive operation haven't managed to complete one important thing. The Ukrainians haven't managed to build trenches in the fortifications. And of course, you can take under control a lot of territories, but it doesn't matter. It's not so important as to be able to hold these lines as long as you need. And if you need to long these lines and these territories for another year, that means that you need to build significant number of fortifications, to build supply roads, and to prepare this territory for winter period of time. The Ukrainians during the previous phase of the Kursk offensive were trying to bring some engineering equipment, but later we realized that the Ukrainians were using the engineering equipment mainly for the evacuation of destroyed vehicles and not for the buildings of the fortifications. Maybe the Ukrainians are planning to survive during the winter period of time in the city of Sudzha, because there are lots of buildings, lots of places where the Ukrainians can redeploy their forces, but this is too risky because the Russians basically will reduce the city of Sudzha to ruins if they realize that there are lots of Ukrainian soldiers. What the Russians are doing right now, the only possible place where the Ukrainians can hide their forces is forest. There are a lot of forests in this area, but forest is not so good defense belt against the Russian FAPs, and so that's why maybe it can secure a little bit the Ukrainian lines, but it's not the solution. This is not the solution, and the more the Russians are going to use FAPs and Su-34, the less possibilities and the less chances for the Ukrainians to hold these territories for a very long period of time. Furthermore, a lot of Western military experts continue saying that most likely the Ukrainians by the winter would be forced to fall back from this territory, and probably for free, for nothing. Now Zelensky is planning to use this territories to change this territory for something in Ukraine. Maybe Zelensky wants to change Sudzha area for Zaporozhye nuclear power plant or something like this. But today the foreign minister of the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, made a statement that these conclusions made by Zelensky is not serious. It's something like a joke, and Russia will never will never use this approach. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, share my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.